Revelation 14, I believe we got through the first handful of verses as we finished up chapter 13, and we spent a few minutes looking at that incredible number 666 and saw what that might be. But I do want to read chapter 14 to us. And so beginning in verse 1, here's what John writes. He said, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless." Verse 6, "Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. And he said with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water.' Another angel, a second, followed, saying, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality.'" Verse 9, "And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, 'If anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name.' Here's a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus." Verse 13, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying," write this, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the throne, 'Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come. For the harvest of the earth is fully ripe.' So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the altar, or has authority over the fire. And he called out with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, 'Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia." Okay, well, last week we talked about salvation, and one of the things that I wanted to establish is that 13 and 14 are meant to be read side by side. And so you have the first beast, the second beast, and we talked about Rome and those forces that propagate Rome, and here you find again that judgment that is called out. We looked at those first 5 verses, and we saw the worship of heaven. We've seen this picture that's painted again, a song that's sung that recalls chapter 5. We'll see again in chapter 15. But I think where we ended last week were those aspects of the redeemed in verse 4 and 5. And this is one of those beautiful ethical lists that we see. Who are the people who are God's people? How do they act? And again, this would have been language that would have been a lot more familiar to them and how they view spiritual things than necessarily we do today. There's the Mount of Jerusalem. We talked about how all have a mark that's given. Here we are, the redeemed. And so the idea is, number one, not those who have defiled themselves with women, for they are virgin. Now, y'all, this is a symbolic imagery of those who haven't committed spiritual adultery. That's one of the great images that we see throughout Revelation, is that immorality, that sexual immorality, is tied often to, yes, possible physical sexual immorality, sexual sins, but also is a picture of what? Idolatry, right? That cheating on God, literally, with all of those marital images of unfaithfulness. And so here it's not talking necessarily about those that wouldn't be in a marriage relationship, I'm pretty sure God's pretty high on that. I've read Genesis 1 and 2, right? God happens to be a fan of marriage, okay, and relationships. God has nothing against any sexual relationship within the proper bounds. As a matter of fact, Song of Songs and multiple other texts make, young people a little nervous, like, whoa, that's in Scripture? And the answer is, yeah, it's in Scripture, right? And so here it's not talking about the physical act. I think it's talking about the spiritual reality of what we do or what people do when they cheat on God. And they're couched in terms that would have been very familiar back then. The idea of like those who haven't defiled themselves. Think of the idea like contaminated, whether you think of maybe those Old Testament purity laws or something that was clean that got dirty today. But in the ancient world, sex and fertility and everything associated with it was given a mysterious power. We may treat these things flippantly. They did as well, but the amazing thing is they may have treated sexual things as flippantly, but many of them also saw the powerful nature of simply that act. Why so much was tied in the Roman system of cult and of idolatry with sexual practices. I mean, there were these churches in these cities that would have had temples filled full of male and female prostitutes. And frankly, that was how you, quote unquote, went to church back then, in a sense, right, with those pagan practices. And so here John is painting a very real picture as a preacher of saying, hey, God's people, we don't do that anymore, just as we saw in chapters 2 and 3, and we see all throughout Scripture. This is not what we do and how we act anymore. But what I also love is a picture from the Old Testament, that if the 144,000 could be pictured like a census for an army. By the way, I know that was weeks ago in chapter 7. We've already seen that number. One of the great things that was commanded of those who went into battle, does anybody remember if you were newly married, what you were allowed to do if you were a Jewish man?
Take a year off.
You got to take a year off to be with your bride. What a cool law. Yeah, to make her happy, it says, Deuteronomy 23. Which is a neat thing to think about back then. Of again, how God viewed marriage. But also, this was also a command. Deuteronomy 23:9. When you are encamped against your enemies, then you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. By the way, that had a sexual overtone. If you want to know an Old Testament story, what made Uriah so righteous? If you remember when he slept outside of David's door instead of going home to Bathsheba to kind of unleash David's plan there after getting Bathsheba pregnant, hoping Uriah would get home and maybe wink, wink, hush, hush. Uriah didn't just sleep outside of David's palace because he was one of his mighty men. When the army was encamped against enemies, for lack of a better term, you didn't go home for conjugals. Uriah was faithful to David, but more importantly, in light of Deuteronomy 23, he was faithful to his God. He wasn't going to go home to Bathsheba, even with David encouraging him. That's why he said no. This is what we don't do. We are about to fight our fight. That old adage of boxers, right? To get away from women. I know that's old-timey. If you ever heard of like fighting boxing cultures, they went away to camp. That's why fighters go away to camp. Get away from all the distractions, right? Ladies would have been one of them. No offense to the ladies. But here, that's that picture. So whether you see the 144,000 as the Lord's army or just simply an enactment of this simple truth, this isn't what we do. But those that are betrothed to the Lord have a way that they're called to act. If somebody would read Revelation 17, 1 through 5, so I can take a sip of something after talking so stinking much.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations.
Thank you. Pretty extreme. Now, again, we got a lot to unpack whenever we get there, but you can see this picture here. God's people are not people involved in that kind of stuff. And so that, I think, gives us this picture here of not defile themselves with women, for they are virgins. It's not just talking about a marital relationship. And by the way, this would only apply to men, but I'm pretty sure this would apply to all of God's faithful. But John's here preaching with images, right, that would have been familiar from the Old Testament and familiar to them. We see also that follows the Lamb wherever he goes. And of course, I can't help but think of those great disciple passages. Mark 8, right? If anyone, would come after me, what does Jesus said? Let him. And then do what? Follow me. One of the great commands of Jesus found throughout the Gospels, follow me. And here the same thing, to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Number 3, redeemed from mankind, that purchased and ransomed imagery that we see. I can't help but think of, again, if we're thinking about maybe the immorality aspect, that could be mentioned here to a degree. I think of 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20, the idea of you were purchased with a price, so glorify God, right, with your body. Your body's a temple of the Spirit of God. I think also we'll get to Zephaniah here in a minute. Or did I skip Zephaniah in my notes? Where did Zephaniah come from? I don't know. We'll get there in a minute. We might figure that one out. Oh, there it is. I got a couple more. Don't go there yet. Number 4 is first fruits for God and the Lamb, both useful, are used for both Jewish and Gentile believers. Christ himself being the front runner as the first fruit, 1 Corinthians 15:23. But it's used to describe the entire group, not just the first of those that follow. But then what we see here it is for Zephaniah, number 5, no lie was found, for they are blameless. Church, we're ambassadors of truth, as one commentator said, rather than enemies of falsehood. In what we say and in how we live. If Sonny would read Zephaniah 3:12 through 13 for me, please. Tell them I said hello.
But I will leave in your midst a people humble and lowly. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord. Those who are left in Israel, they shall do no injustice and speak no lies. Nor shall there be found in their mouth a deceitful tongue. For they shall graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid.
There you go. Thank you, sir. Opposite, by the way, are those filled full of falsehood. Chapter 3, verse 9. And of course, that famous Revelation 21:8. But the idea of blameless is found, of course, throughout God's people. One of Paul's great terms, speaking of the life that we're called to live, Ephesians 1:4, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless. Echoed in Philippians 2 and Colossians 1. And so we think about these things for this first. And so a couple of quick points by way of theology, and then we'll open up for any questions or comments before we get to our next section, is that first of all, we need to see the contrast between God and the evil ones. And remember, that's what we're talking about, that false trinity of the dragon and the first beast and the second beast. We need to see that there's a Zion and then there's a Babylon. We need to see that there are two different marks, the marks of the beast. And here the mark that is given, or the seal that is given, of the people of God. There's a future of the redeemed as well as the fate and the inhabitants of the earth. And then we see that there is a quote-unquote spiritual celibacy by way of faithfulness, but then versus a spiritual fornication by way of idolatry and immorality. And then, of course, there's truth and deceit. Here in these first 5 verses, John is presenting that contrast as an ethical teaching of God's people. Who are those who belong to God versus those who belong to the evil ones? And as the bride of Christ, we're called to be faithful. James 1:27, a religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. And then what is the last one? Does anybody remember? To keep oneself unstained from the world. 2 Peter 3:14, therefore, beloved, since you were waiting for these, talking about that new heaven in new earth. Peter writes, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish, and at peace. That's how we're called to live. And so that's the first thing, is we can see the contrast, and that's why we have these two chapters. Those of these evil ones versus those of the Lamb. Keep that in your mind when you see these images. And then the second thing, well, there's our text, is that believers cannot lose sight of future blessings so that they can remain watchful and faithful today. We're about to look in the rest of this chapter at endurance and faithfulness. Again, is that constant ethical refrain. Yes, we see elements of truthfulness, but one of the aspects that sometimes gets lost in our Christian walk, we talk about love, and we talk about patience, right? We may talk about self-control, but that's through gritted teeth, right? Especially when we go to the Chinese buffet, okay? But we speak of all of these fruits of the Spirit, so to speak, but Revelation elevates one that's vital, and that's simply endurance. That continued faithfulness, that long-haul walk with God, even in the midst of an unjust, sinful world. And here, that's one of the things that John is urging us towards, is to think and to live in such a way. Any questions or comments? We'll save snide remarks for the end. Snide remarks for the end, Brother Bill. Anybody got any thoughts? Beautiful images, by the way, as a preacher preaching here, of just hitting one after another. Beautiful ethical points of the people who follow the Lamb. So let's think about verses 6 through 13 of judgment and reward. And here you get three angels. Again, angels being those great messengers of God. And here's the first one that we see, is that angel number 1 proclaims the eternal gospel, verses 6 and 7. The hope remains, are you listening? Hope remains as long as one can receive the good news of Jesus Christ. Guess when time runs out. When does time run out? When the Lord returns. Guess what we get to do? And guess what should go forth until then? The gospel. The angel comes right out of the gate. And first thing about this life, this Zion, this great promise, first things first, keep preaching that gospel. In light of these false things, in light of these promised realities, in light of how you are called to live, angel number 1, proclaim the gospel. And I love how this is the only time in the New Testament that it is called the eternal gospel. Interesting phrase. Eternal good news. Fun fact, if there is good news, there must be what? We're about to get to the bad news. But what makes it gospel, which means good news, is again the one behind it. And by the way, who is invited according to this text? What does it say, verses 6 and 7?
People in every tongue and tribe and nation.
Sounds an awful like go forth into the world, all nations, right? Baptizing them. Or Acts 1, this gospel will be preached here into Samaria, and then does anybody remember Acts 1:8? To the ends of the earth. The angel says, keep it going. First things first. Judgment and reward, keep it going. Part of the good news is that it is in light of bad news. But sadly, there will be many who don't receive it. And it's not talking about numbers. God is not the eternal accountant, so to speak, with his ledger. If we understand being the loving Father, one is one too many. Right? If you have 99 sheep and he loses one, that matters. Right? Any parent, if you had 100 kids, that's weird. But if you have 10 kids, if you have 8 kids, if you have 3 kids, if you have 2 kids, losing one is how many too many? One. That's God. Don't think percentages, right? Let's not try to do the math in our heads. Let's think from God's thoughts. But the reality is many will not. And that's a reality. If somebody would read John 3, a few verses after those golden texts, verse 18, and then down to verse 36. By the way, from the lips of Jesus. If somebody would read that.
Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him.
John and Jesus got it honest from Jesus, right? Or excuse me, Jesus of course got it honest, but John got it honest from Jesus with verse 36, because that is a beautiful, or you might say, it might be difficult to comprehend, but Revelation 14 from here on out is these realities. These realities of what happens. But it starts, by the way, with the angel proclaiming. And do you notice what volume is the angel according to this text?
Loud, great.
Loud. I like loud people. All right? I am one. I is one. I would call my mother when I would get home from school to let her know that I was safe and sound at home before I would sneak out every couple of times. Because that was when kids could get away with stuff. Right? And she would go, "Why are you yelling?" And I'm like, "I'm not. I am talking on the phone." And what got me in trouble in school, I have told y'all before, has turned out to be a pretty valuable asset in my profession. So maybe God knew what He was doing. And sorry for blowing your ears out all those years, Mama. There you go. When I talk to you on the phone, right? I like a loud angel. The idea is he can be heard. Are you listening? To all nations. Just a funny little picture I read, and I smiled and I went, oh, I like a loud angel. That works. That works for me. All right. Second angel is this picture that we're going to unpack later, but we get the glimpse, the fall of Babylon. By the way, a fitting picture for Rome, since Babylon brought down Jerusalem. Yeah, in Jeremiah. Babylon brought down Jerusalem in 587 or 586. And then you can see why Rome was called Babylon as well. And especially if we take the latter date, for the book of Revelation, which I lean towards, the Romans have already destroyed Jerusalem. So Babylon is a fitting title for Rome. And that's why I think that idea of Babylon is tied to Rome. Remember what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that from here on out, if what we've been looking at from chapter 6 to about chapter 11 is this broad spectrum picture of judgments and the evil aspects of this earth and what God is doing in light of that. Here, from chapters 13 onward, you could almost say the focus narrows, but the message is the same. And what I mean by that is the focus narrows is I think Rome and the things of Rome and the Roman Empire are held up as the premium example, the example par excellence of how these evil forces operate in the world throughout time and throughout cultures. And of course, we're seeing judgment pronounced on Rome, and that's going to be our motivation as well as giving us the right eyes to see the world in which we live, where these same forces are at play. And so here, I think John is introducing an idea that would have been familiar to his churches as part of that apocalyptic language. That, hey, the gospel is going to be proclaimed, but as we've seen, those that stand against God and the things of God will fall. Isaiah 21:9. And behold, here come the riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods has shattered to the ground. 1 Peter 5:13 helps us. By the way, this is a letter of Peter to those churches, right, that are scattered about. He writes, 1 Peter 5:13, She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. He concludes his letter, and most scholars, and I agree, that the Babylon that he's referring is an individual who was in Rome. And I love how Peter just has a slang term. He doesn't say Rome. He goes ahead and calls it Babylon. I think that helps us see here. Now, this doesn't mean that all of Revelation ended at the fall of Rome around the 400 or 500s AD. But again, Rome par excellence, so to speak, or the worldly forces par excellence, but fall. But you see the idea of drink, an image that's found throughout the Bible. The idea of drink here, which is participating in lifestyle. Somebody would read Jeremiah 5:7-9 for me. build in my coffee sips, y'all. I know those pages get stuck together in those prophets, so y'all.
Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunk. The nations drink of her wine, therefore the nations make mad. Suddenly Babylon has fallen and been broken. Wail for her. Take balm for her pain. Perhaps she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she was not healed. Forsake her and let us go each to his own country, for her judgment has reached up to heaven and has been lifted up even to the skies.
Man, John knew what he was preaching in the midst of things that had already occurred. And how Babylon had acted is exactly how Rome is acting, as all those worldly empires act. Again, the hope of what Jeremiah wished would have occurred by way of preaching in Israel and the world, but just the realities of how things are. But God isn't pulling any punches with us. And this is where that picture, often uncomfortable in Revelation, the idea of the great prostitute comes from, where Babylon is spoken often as her, and her immoralities. And that is just a picture that is simply painted, participating in her fornications, right? And we're going to see a lot of that in chapters 17 and 18 of Revelation. But here, one commentator said, when it comes to verse 8 of Revelation 14, economic security comes at an awful high spiritual price. And so here, giving into these things costs.
This is also a picture of the cup of wrath, that it's so beautiful. I mean, we think God's bringing judgment, but really it's what we choose to drink. We take in the cup of wrath that looks so beautiful, but it's poison.
Yes.
And it's that's the prophet's song, and even Jesus let this cup pass.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate Miss Gay. That cup imagery and drinking of the cup, right, is such a rich imagery, not just with so many cultural ties then, but just the beautiful spirituality aspects, or the spiritual aspects that are drawn from that metaphor, right? And Miss Gay made the point of, we think of drinking of this cup from Rome, so to speak, or drinking from this cup, it's actually wrath, right? It's actually poisonous to us. We're opposite, right? You might say when John, well, it's a different image of John eating the scroll. It tastes sweet, but it gets bitter, right? This is a cup that just is it seems like a good thing now, but it's ultimately poison eternally. But here it gets poured out, you might say, which was a rich imagery then, and maybe in some cultures and cases now, when it comes to the wrath of God. Yes, ma'am, Miss Jeanette.
These things that you're thinking of, the drink and the prostitution, all this stuff, they're addictive. And,
Oh, yeah.
And you lose sight of what you're supposed to say. So let this stuff go.
That is an excellent point. Miss Jeanette spoke even of the prostitution and these drink imageries of how addictive a lot of it is. And it's hard to let that go. And you can see, again, these images that are used in the midst of the gospel preach, but also of the pull of these elements. And I think a lot of us would admit of so many elements of this world that keep us trapped, or keep us, right, that idea of drunkenness, that keep our eyes, right, foggy, our minds cloudy. That's a great observation, right? But ultimately, judgment is a reality. Boy, I don't know if I just want to jump into like a picture of hell with like 5 minutes left, but, well, angel number 3, the judgment that follows. This is a warning that's based off the mark that we see in chapter 13, verses 15 and 16. But the wine of God's wrath, notice what it said. What does it say about it? It's poured out what? In what way? What's the imagery? Anybody see it there? Yeah, full strength. Y'all, back then, what many would do, and I've actually got a recipe for table wine in the early church with a scholar upstairs, is they would take wine, which of course would be fermented, and most of the regular that would be drunk because you couldn't trust water sources back then. And so wine would be diluted with 1 part or 2 parts water. And so when it came to like when you drank wine somewhere, it would be watered down unless the purpose was obviously to, not want it watered down, right? With what that leads to. Well, here, John, again, is using a common idea. And by the way, it'd make it last longer. The alcohol would purify some of the water. So that was kind of the idea in the first century context of how a lot of that operated culturally. Where here, John just uses a preaching metaphor that when it comes to God's wrath and it comes to this judgment, it's not cut with anything. It's not diluted in any way. And so the strength that it is poured out full strength. Psalm 75, verse 8, For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup with foaming wine, well mixed, and he pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. We don't often think of that as being smack dab there in the middle of the Psalms, but sure enough, there it is. This imagery. And then in verse 14, you get one of these pictures of, frankly, hell. This torment that's used throughout Revelation to speak of suffering. If somebody would read Revelation 20, verse 10.
And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. They will be tormented day and night, forever and ever.
We've been talking about that dragon and that beast, right? And that false prophet from chapter 13. Here, their judgment comes in the end. And here you see this overlapping imagery of those with them. And the idea of no rest, day or night, speaks of a constant restlessness. The opposite, by the way, of what God's people receive, which is what? When it comes to whether it's spiritually in Hebrews 4 of entering into God's rest, by the way, the beautiful picture of that Sabbath from the Old Testament, but ultimately here, one of those pictures of heaven. And y'all, I don't want you to picture, we're going to get to chapters 21 and 22. I'm not talking about that great heavenly hammock in the sky for all eternity, okay? But there is a picture that is used of the place where God is and us being with Him as that place of rest. And here, the contrast is obviously one of the aspects of hell is it is a place of constant restlessness. If you can imagine being exhausted but never being able to sleep. The torment. Again, y'all, when we think of or hell and what's said of hell, I don't want you to just think of like fire and pitchforks, right? Here it's about a quality of life, and the ultimate picture that I can give that if heaven, to me, is best explained as the place where God is. I go to prepare a place for you. What does Jesus say? John 14:3. That where I am, what? That's my picture. Whatever we think of 21 and 22, we'll get there. Understand that we will be with Him. Well, whatever hell is, and we can debate whether it's eternal conscience or if there's a point of annihilation. We can, and I've got scholars that can argue on duration, whatever it is. What I do know is that whatever it is, I want you to think of everything opposite of God, because God will be removed. Whatever we get with God, hell is its opposite. And here in verse 11, you get one of these initial pictures of it. But those who are marked by the beast are fully giving over to it. And we'll talk maybe just a little bit more about it next week. And maybe try to start like the class off with a joke instead of jumping off into it. But anyways, we'll talk about it. But that's a wrap. Any questions, comments, side remarks? We'll talk more about it next week. God bless you.